Welcome back, and now for the news in detail. Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan has warned that a war between India and Pakistan could end up in a nuclear conflict. In an interview, Khan said Pakistan will never start a war, but it will fight to death for Kashmiri's freedom. He said Kashmiris are living under siege for the last 41 days. The Prime Minister added that India is trying to divert the world's attention from occupied Kashmir by blaming Pakistan for terrorism. He went on to say that the international community must act now to avoid a potential disaster which would threaten the entire region. Khan said he tried to start dialogue with India, but New Delhi is campaigning in world to impose economic sanctions against Pakistan. He said due to Indian attitude, Islamabad is no more interested in talking to New Delhi. Pakistan's Foreign Office has summoned Indian diplomat Gaurav Ahluwalia to condemn ceasefire violations by Indian forces along the line of control. The Foreign Office said Indian forces are deliberately targeting civilians using artillery fire and automatic weapons. It said Indian actions are against international law and a threat to regional peace. Earlier, a woman was killed in Indian fighting in the Nikyal and Jandarod sectors. 9 others were wounded and were evacuated to a nearby medical facility. Tensions between India and Pakistan increased after New Delhi stripped occupied Kashmir of its autonomy on 5th of August. New Delhi has arrested and exiled over 45 Kashmiris over the past month from the Indian-occupied Kashmir. Srinagar police say the arrested Kashmiris have been moved to jails in different states of India. Shopaiya district of the valley tops the list with over 40 civilians detained under controversial Indian public safety law. The people of occupied Kashmir have been looking for their missing relatives who have been detained since August the 5th. Meanwhile, Nobel laureate Malala Yousafzai has called upon the UN to work for peace in the occupied territory. The activist said stability in the valley will allow children to go back to their schools and resume their education. The Indian government is building its first detention center for illegal immigrants in the northeast state of Assam. The pace of construction has picked up after the state government issued a list of citizens last month that rendered 2 million people stateless. More in this report.
India's hardline Hindu nationalist government has targeted religious and ethnic minorities since first assuming office in 2014. It's turned up the heat since being re-elected in May. First, it revoked the special constitutional status of Indian-occupied Kashmir and imposed an indefinite curfew across the valley. Then, the BJP state administration in Assam issued a list of citizens which deprived Muslim immigrants of their fundamental rights. Labourers have cleared a forest the size of 7 football fields to build the state's first detention centre for immigrants deprived of Indian citizenship.
There will be 15 4-story buildings under construction here, 13 for males and 2 for females.
Some of the workers said they are among the 2 million people declared stateless by the Assam government. They fear they could end up in the detention camp they are building.
Those who do not have their names in the National Register of Citizens would be kept here. India's biggest detention camp is being constructed here.
Despite New Delhi's decision to disenfranchise millions, Dhaka has refused to accept anyone declared an illegal immigrant by India.
The US has blamed Iran for leading attacks on Saudi oil plants that have cut the kingdom's output roughly in half. Earlier, Yemen's Houthis claimed the responsibility for the attacks, but Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said there was no evidence the attacks came from Yemen. The attacks cut Saudi Arabia's daily oil production by nearly 5 million barrels, which is 5% of the global production. The US Secretary of State called on all the nations to condemn Iran's attacks. Pompeo said Iran has now launched an unprecedented attack on the world's energy supply.
Iran destabilizes this entire region. It supports proxy militias and terrorist groups. It arms It is an arms dealer to the Houthi rebels in Yemen.
Earlier in a phone call, President Donald Trump offered Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman support for his country's self-defense. Now moving on, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees has condemned mobile phone ban in Rohingya camps by Bangladesh. The UN body said Rohingya should not be subjected to any restrictions which stop them from contacting their relatives. In a statement, UNHCR said Bangladesh government is responsible for ensuring security and safety of Rohingya. The UNHCR spokesperson Andre Mahisich said security measures should not impact refugees' access to basic services and rights. Rejecting the statement, Dhaka said there are no restrictions as refugees can contact their relatives whenever they want. Afghanistan's former Prime Minister Gulbuddin Hekmatyar has said Afghan forces do believe the conflict in the country is a holy war. He said youngsters are joining the lines of the forces due to economic constraints and poverty. Speaking in Kabul, former politician said over 300 members of Afghan National Defense and Security are killed every day. He said current Kabul government is the biggest hurdle for peace and leadership, as it is happy in the continuation of war. Calling on Taliban, he said the group should continue talks with Afghans after failure of their dialogue with the US. Meanwhile, presidential spokesperson Siddiq Siddiqui has asked Hekmatyar to apologize to Afghan forces for his remarks. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has pledged to avoid parliamentary legislation ruling out a no-deal Brexit. Johnson has likened Britain to the Incredible Hulk as it seeks to break free from the European Union. In an interview, Johnson said the UK will break out of the EU's manacles like the green-skinned superhero. He drew parallels between UK's situation in Brexit talks and the frustrations felt by the fictional scientist. Johnson has maintained he wants to negotiate a new deal with the EU that does not involve a backstop. But the EU has so far insisted on the backstop, and Britain has not presented any detailed alternative. Meanwhile, ex-Tory Minister Sam Gyimah has switched to the pro-EU Liberal Democrat Party in protest against Johnson's Brexit policies. In Syria, government forces have killed 6 civilians in shelling near a Turkish military observation post in Idlib province. The Syrian Human Rights Observatory says the army's artillery barrages have also targeted rural areas in Aleppo, Hama and Latakia. It says the rebels also fired on government positions in the recently captured town of Khan Sheikhoun in Idlib. The Monitor says there are no reports of casualties yet. Meanwhile, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has called for a probe into a series of attacks on hospitals in Idlib. In another development, the residents of Russia, Turkey and Iran will meet in Ankara on Monday. Officials said they will discuss fighting in Idlib, the Syrian refugee crisis and the political settlement to the conflict. Syrian government has opened a new checkpoint in de-escalation zone of Idlib to ensure humanitarian aid and safe exit of civilians. Russian army official Alexei Bakin said militants from the zone can also lay down arms there. Bakin said Abu al-Dohar checkpoint and corridor will provide medical treatment and vehicles to the civilians leaving Idlib. He said a group of militants is still violating ceasefire as 34 cases of shelling were recorded in Aleppo and Idlib in past 2 days. Meanwhile, Syrian state media reported militants are stopping civilians from leaving through Abu al-Dahar checkpoint. President Donald Trump has discussed the possibility of a defense treaty with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The conversation between the two leaders took place 3 days before Israeli voters go to the polls. President Trump said such an agreement would further anchor the tremendous alliance between the two countries. He also endorsed Netanyahu's re-election bid by saying he would look forward to continue discussions after Israel elections. Earlier, Netanyahu pledged to annex Israeli settlements in the Jordan Valley if re-elected. Netanyahu is fighting his second election in 5 months with the potential corruption indictment looming. He suffered a major defeat in April when he failed to form a coalition. The Turkish Foreign Ministry says the OIC will hold a meeting in Jeddah today to discuss Israel's plans to annex areas of the occupied West Bank. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said he would annex the Jordan Valley and other illegal settlements if he wins elections next week. Middle Eastern and the EU countries expressed alarm at Israel's intention. Arab foreign ministers also condemned the plan as an act of aggression. They said it would undermine any chances of peace settlement with Palestine. The Jordan Valley is part of the occupied West Bank that Israel captured in 1967 war. More stories to follow right after a short break. Stay tuned with Indus News. Welcome back. In France, Yellow Vest protesters rallied in Paris for the 44th consecutive week against President Emmanuel Macron's policies, but the turnout remained well below the peaks last year. A crowd of around 150 demonstrators marched towards the Place d'Italie Square. They were escorted by dozens of police. Starting last year against a hike in fuel taxes, the Yellow Vest movement is set to mark its first anniversary next month. Italy has allowed rescue ship Ocean Viking carrying 82 migrants to disembark at Lampedusa. The move is hailed as a reversal of the uncompromising closed-door policy of the previous administration. The vessel picked up the migrants off Libya and had asked both Italy and Malta for permission to dock. Foreign Minister Luigi Di Maio said that French ship was allowed port only after European countries agreed to take in migrants. Earlier, German Interior Minister Horst Seehofer said Berlin will take in a quarter of migrants who arrive in Italy by boat. EU states will meet in Malta on September 23rd to discuss migration issue. According to the UN, around 850 migrants have died at sea in 2019 so far. At least 9 people have been killed after a bus collided with a truck in Russia's Yaroslav region. Local Department of Healthcare said 28 others were injured in the accident. The department said 9 ambulance crews are working at the scene. Traffic police said the accident occurred because of a truck driving into the oncoming lane. The Interior Ministry has launched a criminal investigation. Russia's first floating nuclear power plant has arrived to its permanent base near an isolated town across the Bering Strait from Alaska. Russian state nuclear energy company Rosatom says it aims to make the floating station operational by the year end. Rosatom says it will become the world's northmost nuclear power plant. This facility will replace an aging nuclear power plant in Chukota region. Rosatom says it plans to launch more seaborne power units. It says such arrangements can help the environment by reducing greenhouse gas emissions causing global warming. West African leaders have pledged $1 billion to combat the escalated threat of terrorism in the region. A regional bloc summit in Burkina Faso and the bloc said Al-Qaeda and ISIS-backed groups have strengthened their foothold across the Sahel region. The Economic Community of West African States said the militants have fueled local ethnic violence, especially in Mali and Burkina Faso. ECOWAS President Mahamadou Issoufou said the rising violence has displaced 3 million people this year alone. He also called on the UN to strengthen its peacekeeping mission in Africa.
The international community has the duty to participate in the battle to safeguard peace and security.
Earlier, the UN asked West Africa to consider strengthening its response beyond current military efforts amid rising militant attacks. Now moving on, forensic scientists in Mexico have identified 44 bodies buried in a well in the state of Jalisco. The remains were discovered after local residents complained about foul odor from the well. The human remains were hidden in 119 black bags. A local organization has appealed to the government to send more specialists to assist with the identification process. They say the local forensic department does not have the necessary skills to complete the operation. During his election campaign, Mexican President Manuel López Obrador has promised to bring down record levels of violence. The country has already had over 17,000 murders in the first half of 2019. Unable to trust the government to keep the drug cartels in check, many people have taken up arms and formed their own vigilante groups. The details in this report. Commander Toro is one of the Mexican citizens taking the law into their own hands in the western state of Michoacán. His real name is German Ramirez, and he was once a school teacher. This all changed 6 years ago when cartel hitmen kidnapped and murdered his father.
The fact that we are armed is not well seen. We are in the eye of the storm. We are visible, and people get it wrong. People who have other interests other than looking after the town. What about them? Are they good?
Today, Commander Toro has 200 armed civilians working under him. They patrol Michoacán's highways and roads, throwing out but not killing unwanted intruders and suspected cartel members. Unable to do this itself, the local police force lets vigilante groups operate with impunity, sometimes even giving them weapons.
I'm not worried. I do get angry, and we are not afraid. Many complain about the federal government. Until now, they have not bothered us.
During his election campaign, Mexican President Manuel López Obrador said he would pursue an amnesty deal with cartels to bring peace to Mexico. Now, he says his newly created elite police force, the National Guard, will restore order.
We want them to come and take over security, whether it be the National Guard, whoever it is, but it should be the government who takes over security, and that they care about us as citizens.
Though these vigilante groups help contain the violence, security experts say they also strike deals with the very cartels they are meant to be fighting. But with the president's pledges falling flat, right now Mexico has no other option. The tropical storm Alberto has lashed the Bahamas with rain and wind. The downpour is slowing down relief efforts on the islands, which were recently hit by Hurricane Dorian. Forecasters said the storm is expected to strengthen into a hurricane later today. The U.S. National Hurricane Center said the center of the storm was passing about 50 miles to the east of a Great Abaco Island. It was one of the areas hardest hit by Hurricane Dorian. The Bahamian National Emergency Management Agency says 5 to 10 centimeters of rain is expected in most areas in the next 48 hours. On his arrival in Nassau, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres pledged aid and assistance to the hurricane victims.
I hope that the international community will be able. Now obviously is the moment of still rescue in some situations, but essentially humanitarian aid. But then there will be reconstruction, building resilience, recovery, and this will require massive investments from the government, from the people, and of course international support will be absolutely essential.
With 1,300 people still missing, the Bahamian government is focusing primarily on search and rescue operations. Now moving on to Denmark, where the people have donated over $2.5 million in the world's first ever climate telethon. The Danes came together to raise money for planting 1 million trees in the Scandinavian country. The fundraising event was described as the first of its kind to focus on climate. For every donation of $3, one tree will be planted. 20% of the funds raised will go to the forest conservation efforts in Denmark and abroad. The plantation drive seeks to reduce the escalating concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And now the weather updates from around the globe. And that's all for now. For further updates, stay tuned to Indus News.